Before we get started with today's episode of the podcast, I just want to take a minute to tell you about a free masterclass for dance teachers that I have coming up soon. The NeuroFlex Masterclass, Identifying the Missing Link in Your Dancer's Flexibility, is happening on Sunday, February 2nd. The nervous system is queen when it comes to the body. It controls our ability to see, think, feel, breathe, and move. This means it controls our flexibility and mobility. Nervous system dysregulation is one of the biggest factors limiting a dancer's mobility that most teachers miss. In this masterclass, you'll learn about the link between the nervous system and mobility and how to harness the power of the nervous system to improve your dancer's flexibility. I would love to have you join me on Sunday, February 2nd. So for more information and to save your free spot in the masterclass, you can go to www.allegroperformance.com/masterclass. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to be talking about when stretching just doesn't seem to be working. And this is something I see quite commonly, actually, in the clinic, people coming in who have goals of working on their flexibility, and they have been stretching a lot. And so this could be younger dancers. This is often adult dancers who are coming in. And like I said, they're working on their flexibility pretty diligently. So they're stretching really consistently and they're like, I stretch every day, or I stretch really consistently. I'm doing all of these different stretches, but I just don't seem to be making progress in my flexibility, or I feel tight all the time. And so they're sort of coming in and saying, what other stretches can I be doing? What is it that I'm doing wrong, or that type of thing? And oftentimes it has absolutely nothing to do with the actual stretches that they're doing. I think people come in and they're like, what's the magical stretch that you can give me that's going to allow me to get my splits, or allow me to increase my back flexibility, or whatever their goal is when it comes to flexibility. And unfortunately, that is just not the way the world works. And there isn't usually a magic stretch or one magic thing that I can give people. But one of the things that we can do is dive a little bit deeper into maybe why they are not making the progress that they hope to be making, or that they want to be making when it comes to their flexibility. And one of the biggest things, and one of the biggest teaching things that we spend time talking about and sort of teaching clients, is that although they come in and say they have flexibility goals, what they likely have is mobility goals. And I've talked about this before on the podcast, sort of the difference between flexibility and mobility. And I will put that episode in the show notes if you haven't listened to it yet, and I kind of dive a little bit deeper into that. But I will just give you a quick little recap right now as well. So when we talk about flexibility, we are referring to, or usually sort of talking about, muscles, and specifically muscles' ability to stretch. And so muscles have an elastic property to them, and we can stretch them, and then they sort of contract back down. And over time, we can change sort of the length, the resting length of muscles, and that ability of the muscle to stretch. And so when we're talking about flexibility, that is what we are talking about. What I say, or what I mean when I say that dancers are actually probably talking more about mobility than flexibility, is that dancers usually come in with goals of achieving a certain move or a certain position. So like I said, they want to get their splits, or they want to get a leg mount, or they want to get, I don't know, a scorpion, or whatever it is that is like the skill or the movement that they're looking at. And those goals, or those flexibility, quote unquote, flexibility goals that they're working towards, actually involve what we call mobility, not just flexibility. And so, like I've talked about before on the podcast, mobility is multi-system. So it encompasses muscle flexibility. Muscle flexibility is a component of mobility, but mobility also encompasses other things. So mobility encompasses connective tissues. So that could be the capsules around our joint. It can be the ligaments that support our joints. It could be fascial tissue. It can be all sorts of different types of our connective tissue in our body. And those tissues are important to our overall mobility. And maybe even more important than that, mobility takes into account the nervous system component of movement as well. So our nervous system is our command center in our body, essentially. Our nervous system controls basically everything that our body does. It controls all the automatic functions that happen within our body. So whether that's breathing, heart rate, digestion, things that we don't have to think about. And then it also controls voluntary things. So it controls things like our movements. And we have movements that are controlled voluntarily. We can think about, okay, I'm going to put my leg in this position, or I'm going to move my arm in this direction. But our nervous system also controls movements on a more involuntary basis. Like when we are walking, we don't have to consciously think, pick up leg, put leg down on the ground in front of the other leg. Like we're not thinking about every movement that's involved in the gait process. Those movements have become automated. And so our nervous system is controlling all of our movements. And so when we are thinking about specific goals that we're trying to achieve in dance, and like I said, these often get termed as flexibility goals. What dancers probably actually mean is more mobility. So if we think about a scorpion or a split or just getting their leg higher in a kick or something like that, there's actually a mobility component to that. So we have to consider the muscular component as well, but we also have to consider the nervous system's role in that, and then also the connective tissue's role in that. And so when dancers are coming in and the only thing that they are doing to work on their mobility is stretching, because traditionally in the dance world, that's what we've been taught and told is going to help with our flexibility is stretching, that might be why they're not making the progress they want to be making. So if their muscular flexibility is not the thing limiting their ability to get into certain positions or do certain moves in dance, then doing a lot of stretching and doing that over and over and over and over again isn't necessarily going to get them to their end goal. So today I want to dive a little bit deeper into the connective tissue component and the nervous system component of our mobility, which may be the thing that's holding dancers back when they're trying to achieve their goals. So if we think about the connective tissue, like I said, it encompasses things like ligaments, things like joint capsules, things like fascial tissue. These are tissues or structures that are inherently non-elastic. So they're different than muscles that have that elastic component. These tissues generally do not have that same elastic component. And we don't necessarily want them to have an elastic component because their job within the body is to provide more structural integrity and stability within the body. And whether that be stability locally at a specific joint, or in the case of like fascial tissue, it's a little bit more just like overall structural stability. We often refer to something called like a tensegrity model, which I'm not going to get into today because it's a little bit complicated, but that fascial tissue supports structural integrity throughout the body and provides connections from various areas of the body. And so these are not necessarily tissues that we're looking to stretch out, but like I said, they do impact our mobility quite significantly. And so, like I said at the very beginning of the episode, this sort of problem of dancers coming in and saying, I've been stretching and stretching and stretching, and I'm not making progress in my flexibility. We often see it in older dancers. So my adult dance population are people who come in and sort of often report this. And these are usually dancers who have like a day job. They might have some sort of like a desk job or something like that. And then they're dancing recreationally, like in the evenings or in their leisure time. And so in some of those populations, their connective tissues may have kind of shortened shortened and adapted over time if they haven't been a dancer who's been sort of like dancing their entire life and always been working on, doing a lot of mobility work and stretching and things like that. So in some of those dance populations, we actually need to consider the role that maybe some of their connective tissue is playing, specifically at local joint levels. And so we might actually be looking at doing more like joint mobilizations or techniques or exercises that actually address some of that specific connective tissue restriction, as opposed to just giving them more muscle stretches to do over and over again, because in those cases, it often hasn't been working. They've often been stretching their muscles, but maybe they've been missing a component of actually addressing some mobility at specific joints that might be impeding them. I will say this with a sort of a little bit of like a caveat or a red flag to be aware of. In our younger dance population, so this is specifically our growing dancers, like dancers that are still maturing and still growing, we need to be very careful with how we address techniques that are going to address connective tissue, because we don't want dancers stretching out their connective tissue, because this can cause permanent changes in it. And if they are still growing and still maturing, these changes can actually be detrimental. And so I think most people who listen to the podcast, especially if you're a regular listener, you are sort of familiar with my approach to work and my stance on overstretching. And I've actually done a whole podcast episode on overstretching as well. And this is one of the primary reasons why we do not advocate for overstretching, especially in younger populations, like adolescent populations, because the risk of them actually permanently changing those connective tissue structures is just too high. And so, like I said, in adult dancers, especially ones who seem to have like hit a plateau with their mobility, it may be something that we are missing that we need to address, but we need to be very careful about who and when we are using those types of techniques, because they are definitely not always appropriate for younger dancers. And we certainly don't want to be giving younger dancers kind of stretches or techniques that are going to permanently change those passive connective tissues. The other connective tissue that I just want to touch on briefly is our fascial tissue within our body. So like I said, this impacts kind of like connections from different various areas of the body. It has a bit of a structural component to it. Fascia is like, it is a connective tissue, and it's sort of, we often refer to it as almost like the covering of muscles, but it's more so than that. It connects different layers of tissue and helps to transmit force between various areas of the body. And it has lots of other functions. And in fact, maybe in the future, I'll do an episode entirely on like fascial tissue. But for the purposes of today's episode, what I want to say about fascia is that one of the important components of fascia is not necessarily that it stretches, because like I said, connective tissues are generally like sort of relatively inelastic, but it should have the ability to move. And so it's sort of this, like we often refer to it as kind of sliding or gliding, or the ability for different layers of tissue to move against each other. So fascia often covers muscles, and it's kind of like the outer covering of muscular tissue. And if it is not moving well, so if we get these sort of like, sometimes people will refer to them as like fascial adhesions. I often just call it kind of like stickiness. So we don't get the layers of the fascia moving well over the muscular layers or over the other layers of tissue that it connects with. It can impede our mobility. And so oftentimes we need to address the fascial mobility within our system. And again, there's certain techniques that we might use. You may have heard of like myofascial release. People use that word a lot. It sounds complicated, and people will have you believe that it is a very complicated, very specialized, modality. And there are, practitioners who that's all they practice is kind of myofascial release techniques and things like that. But realistically, what the root of that is that we're just trying to allow those fascial tissues to move freely within the system. And things like using a ball to do some release, or using a foam roller and things like that are techniques that we can use to sort of help to improve myofascial mobility within the system. And so that can be something that can be impeding somebody's mobility. And so they may be stretching, but if they have any sort of like restrictions within the fascial system, those might not be being addressed through those stretches that they are doing consistently. So again, just other things that we might need to address within the mobility realm of things that aren't going to be addressed directly by stretching. So those are a couple of things for sort of like that connective tissue component of mobility. And then the other huge component of mobility, like I was talking about before, is the nervous system. And so, like I said, the nervous system is our command center. Its number one job is to keep us alive. It controls all of our vital functions in life. So heart rate, respiratory rate, all of those things to keep us alive. And that is its number one job. And although it controls everything, so it does control our movement and other functions, if we think of it in this sort of context of its primary job is to keep us alive, it is going to do anything it possibly can to keep us alive. And so it may sacrifice certain functions, and that could be movement, or in our case, mobility, in order to protect against something else that is going on or any other area that it feels threatened. And the nervous system is highly complicated, and I'm not going to get into it too much today. But I do want you to understand the role that it plays in overall mobility. And so if our nervous system is not feeling safe for whatever reason, and it could be a reason directly related to the stretches that we're doing, for instance. And so again, overstretching is an easy example of this, where if a dancer's being, I don't want to say forced, but in some cases it is forced. But even if a dancer is voluntarily doing an overstretch or going into an overstretch position, if the body, aka the nervous system, does not feel safe in this position, and that could be because the dancer doesn't have enough strength to control the position, it could be because they're suspended between two chairs, like one leg on a front chair, one leg on a back chair, or something like that. It could be because they are being forced into this position by a teacher or something like that. If the nervous system feels unsafe for any reason, it is going to try and protect the body. And it can do this through a variety of mechanisms. But one of the easiest ways that it can do this is by limiting mobility. And so the nervous system will actually like tighten up. There's built-in mechanisms in our body called stretch reflexes that are actually these little like feedback pathways that if we, are overstretching something or going into a position that starts to feel dangerous to the body, it will actually like contract the muscle and limit mobility into those positions. So not only are these stretches potentially dangerous from like a connective tissue perspective, but they actually might be impeding our mobility because the body is actually going to tighten up and limit mobility even more. And I just used overstretching as an example of this, but it could be other stretches as well. So if we have a dancer who is relatively inflexible, so maybe they're not even like flat down in their splits, which is very common for dancers. Like a lot of dancers can't get flat in their splits. But we have a dancer who's kind of like hanging out in a split position, but maybe they're like 8 or 10 inches off the floor. That can also feel really threatening to the nervous system. It could be the equivalent of a more flexible dancer doing the oversplits. So we always want to make sure that when our dancers are working on flexibility or working on their mobility, that their body is well supported and we're doing it in positions of safety and positions where our body is not necessarily going to feel threatened while we're doing it. So those are just a couple examples of like, when the body might feel threatened, when we're specifically going into like a stretch position. But the body can feel threatened for all sorts of different reasons that may have absolutely nothing to do with the actual stretch that we're doing. But like I said, one of the easiest responses or the easiest way for the nervous system to try and protect the body or to protect itself is to limit mobility. And so a common time when we see this happen is in dancers who maybe have some underlying hypermobility. So that's like kind of greater than average mobility at their joints. And so That can be accompanied with potentially a decrease in stability at their joints, and that can make the nervous system feel a little bit unsafe. And so this could be people who just locally have increased mobility at one or a few joints, or it could be people with more systemic hypermobility, or even people with underlying connective tissue disorders that lead to hypermobility. So something like a hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or things like that. So there's a big spectrum of people this might apply to, but if the body is dealing with this sort of underlying hypermobility and potentially instability in joints, it might already feel slightly threatened or slightly unsafe due to the underlying things going on. And so it's going to tighten up and lead to a decrease in mobility even before you go into a specific stretch or a specific movement. And so then when you go to try and do your stretch, whatever your stretch is, the body is like, okay, well, now I'm going to protect even more because I'm already feeling slightly threatened. And so now I want to protect myself even more because now you're taking me into this position that feels even more threatening. And so it doesn't always have to directly relate to the exact stretch or the exact movement that we're doing. It can be other things that the nervous system is dealing with in the background, and the output of that is going to be that the nervous system is going to limit mobility. So we want to be able to sort of assess or have an idea or an understanding of what might be limiting a dancer's mobility, and then be able to come at it from that lens. So in the case of the, overstretching or just stretching or the body feeling unsafe in certain positions, oftentimes that's just a case of changing the stretches that we're doing. So rather than having a dancer, hang out in a kind of split position but not be able to get anywhere near the floor so their whole body's tightened up to try and protect them, maybe we do a completely different stretch. And maybe we do a stretch where they're lying on their back and like doing something else with their legs so that there's less of a threat to the nervous system in those positions. We don't have the dancer's whole body weight going through the muscles. Maybe we use more of an active mobility approach. Active mobility is really, really such a useful tool because of the fact that it often creates a lot more safety within the nervous system. So in those cases, we might actually just be able to change what it is we're doing to get a better outcome or a better output so that we actually see improvements in that dancer's mobility. In the case of other systemic underlying things, whether it be like hypermobility or there's so many other things that can be underlying that could be making the nervous system feel threatened. One of the times where we see this a lot is just dancers going through their adolescent growth spurt. And so although it's a completely normal thing and every dancer is going to go through it at some point, or every adolescent dancer is going to go through it at some point, it is a huge change for the body, and it does often temporarily make the nervous system feel kind of unsafe, especially if it's a dancer who's growing really rapidly. If it's kind of a more slow, gradual increase in growth rate, it might not be as threatening. But if we have, these dancers who all of a sudden shoot up like 6 inches overnight, seemingly, that can feel really threatening to the nervous system as it's trying to learn how to navigate this whole new body. And so we want to figure out, okay, what is the underlying thing that's making the nervous system feel unsafe, and then address it. And in the case of an adolescent growth spurt, we're not going to slow down how much you're growing or things like that, but it might mean coming back to basics a little bit. And so oftentimes when we grow really rapidly, there's a relative decrease in strength that accompanies that. And so really going back and working on some basic foundational strength, and whether that's kind of like core strength or strength in individual muscle groups or things like that, that can often have a really profound effect in making the nervous system feel safer and therefore allowing increased mobility to happen. But what we commonly see is dancers are like, oh, I just grew a whole lot. I feel really, really tight. And so I've been stretching like tons, like I'm doing all this extra stretching. And really what that might be doing is actually making the nervous system feel even less safe because it's not used to this new body yet. So like I said, there's lots of different things that can be happening, but if we can identify what it is that's limiting the dancer's mobility, then we're going to be like way better off in terms of trying to address that without necessarily just stretching over and over and over again and not really making any progress. So I'm going to wrap things up there. But like I said, this is something we see really commonly in the clinic where dancers are coming in and saying, I've been doing all this stretching and I'm just not making progress. And if that is you, or if that sounds like some of the dancers that you work with, I would encourage you to start to explore other things that might be limiting your mobility, because just doing more stretching is likely not the answer and is likely not going to give you the results that you're kind of hoping for or looking for. So sometimes we need to sort of take a step back and go back to the drawing board and say, okay, is there something else that's going on? Is there something else that I'm missing that we can look at addressing that will then help me reach those mobility goals? And sometimes people can figure that out on their own, and sometimes people might need a little bit of input. And so whether that's going to your dance teacher and trying to get some help with that, or whether that is seeking out like professional help, whether that be from like a physio or somebody else who is familiar with working with dancers, really trying to figure out what the root cause is and working to address that is going to be hugely beneficial. If this is something that you're interested in learning more about, this is sort of the foundation of the way that I teach flexibility and mobility. And I do have a masterclass coming up on Sunday, February 2nd, specifically for dance teachers to learn how to try and identify what it is that is limiting a dancer's mobility, and specifically if it is the nervous system that is potentially limiting their mobility. So I will put the link to sign up for that in the show notes if you are interested. It is called the NeuroFlex Masterclass, and I would love to have you join me. If you have any questions, comments, want further information about any of this stuff, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at Dance Physio Erika on all the social media platforms. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.